There was a point where RPGs stopped feeling like worlds you wandered through and started feeling like stories you were carried through. More spectacle, longer cutscenes, heavier emotional moments, but somehow less mystery. If you grew up playing 8 and 16-bit role-playing games, you probably know the feeling I'm talking about. Those games felt like they extended in all directions, and you were just one person wandering through that world. Then Final Fantasy VII came, and everything about that game was incredible, but different. Now, this isn't about whether FF7 is a good game. Obviously it is. The question I want to explore is this. Why did RPGs become more impressive while starting to feel less adventurous? The answer involves marketing budgets, storage formats, and one very crucial design decision that quietly rewired how the whole genre thought about itself. To understand what shifted, we have to look closely at what made older RPGs feel the way they did. And the honest answer is, they were kind of incomplete, on purpose. Sprites couldn't convey everything. Text couldn't describe everything, so the gap between what was on screen and what was actually happening in your head, well, that gap was filled by your imagination. And your imagination, it turns out, is extremely good at making things feel epic. Think about Chrono Trigger. The game gave you a time machine, a cast of characters with almost no backstory, and then just kind of turned you loose. It had 12 different endings, optional bosses, storylines that only unlocked if you went looking for them. There were things in that game that a huge number of players never even saw, and the developers were completely fine with that. Final Fantasy VI had over 10 main characters and no single obvious protagonist. Yoshinori Kitase, who directed both FF6 and 7, later said FF6 had many details filled in during development. The world kind of grew outward as they built it. It had that quality of a world that existed before you arrived and would continue after you left. And that's the feeling I'm talking about. Older RPGs often felt bigger than they actually were because your imagination completed them. Now, what's important is that the developers were comfortable letting players miss things. That design philosophy, that the world didn't revolve around making sure you saw everything, is exactly what started to erode. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because the obvious take is that 3D killed the magic, and that's too simple. The real shift wasn't technical. It was a shift in the emotional contract between the player and the developer. Here's the thing about Final Fantasy VII that is important to remember. The decision to leave Nintendo wasn't really about Sony. It was about storage. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, said the pivotal choice was between PlayStation CD-ROMs and the N64's cartridges. A single CG demo Square initially created took 20 megabytes by itself. N64 cartridges topped out around 64 megabytes. CD-ROMs held over 650. So it was a physical impossibility to put Final Fantasy VII on a cartridge. So Square went to PlayStation and suddenly had enough room. Kitase said that in previous games, every decision was shaped by memory limits. With Final Fantasy VII, there were, in his words, no limits and no restraints. The goal was to make the game as cinematic as possible. The cutscenes, the world map, the battle transitions, all designed to flow together like a single unified cinematic work. And that's the moment the contract changed. Before Final Fantasy VII, imagination filled the gaps. After, spectacle became the expectation. Final Fantasy VII convinced the industry that RPGs didn't just need to feel epic anymore. They needed to look epic. And here's where we reach the tipping point. Once individual moments became expensive to create, once a cutscene required a director, animators, voice actors, orchestral music, and months of production time, developers stopped being okay with players potentially missing them. Now that sounds obvious, but think about what it actually means for design. In Final Fantasy VI, you could recruit a character named Gogo, who is found inside a monster you have to be swallowed by in order to find him. A lot of players never found Gogo, and that was fine, the game didn't care. But if Gogo's recruitment scene had cost $250,000 in full-motion video production, suddenly the developers would very much care. So games started funneling. Instead of go see what happens, RPGs increasingly became wait for the next big moment. The result is less wandering, fewer strange detours, tighter pacing, and more linear progression, and crucially, less mystery. Spectacle focuses attention. When you've invested that much in a story beat, you can't afford for players to look away. And so the genre slowly and quietly traded player freedom for cinematic control. And it's not that cinematic RPGs are bad, it's that once cinematic production became the standard, it seemed there was no going back. And the reason no one went back is simple, because it worked. Final Fantasy VII sold over 2 million copies in Japan in 3 days. It hit 1 million in North America by early December 1997. Sony had put $40 million into its global marketing campaign, with roughly half going to North America alone. David Bamberger, Sony's VP of marketing at the time, described FF7 as a tentpole release. That's language borrowed directly from Hollywood. This wasn't a game launch as much as it was a film event. An analyst at the time said Sony had redefined the RPG category and expanded its audience. One of the key reasons Sony and Square leaned so hard into marketing the cinematic quality, according to Kyoko Higo, who worked on the North American campaign, was that explaining RPG mechanics to a mainstream audience was too complicated. The easiest way to sell the game was to show off what it looked like: screenshots, full motion video, spectacle. At the time, you could sell a game on one cutscene screenshot. It was not so easily to market it on player imagination. So when the audience responded, and they responded massively, the lesson the industry learned wasn't make weird, open-ended worlds, it was make things that look impressive. Now again, I want to be careful here because the wrong version of this argument sounds like new RPGs bad, old RPGs good, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the genre optimized for a different emotional experience. Older RPGs often felt strange, a little messy, surprising. You'd bump into something the developers clearly hadn't fully explained and just had to figure it out. That could be frustrating. It was also kind of thrilling. After Final Fantasy VII, RPGs increasingly felt curated, directed, and controlled. The production values went up. The weirdness went down. Xenosaga, one of the PS2 era's most ambitious RPG series, had roughly 7.5 hours of cinematics in each game. Tetsuya Takahashi described the games in terms of camera angles, event models, and smooth cutscene flow. He compared the story to Star Wars. That's not a game that wants you wandering off. That's a game that has a lot it wants to show you. RPGs became less about getting lost in a world and more about reaching the next emotional payoff. And again, that's not a bad thing. These payoffs are often incredible. But something was lost along the way, a certain feeling of openness, of genuine mystery, of a world that didn't revolve around making sure you witnessed the expensive parts. Which is maybe why, starting in the 2010s, something interesting started happening. Indie RPGs like Undertale or Disco Elysium, they started getting serious critical attention, and a lot of people who played them said the same thing. These games feel different. They feel bigger than they look, and that's not a coincidence. Those games rediscovered something the industry had slowly abandoned: the power of leaving things unsaid. Not because their developers were nostalgic, but because worlds feel bigger when the player helps complete them. When a game can't fully show you everything, your imagination takes over. And once that happens, the world starts feeling larger than the hardware running it. We tend to enjoy games not necessarily where the graphics feel limitless, but where the worlds feel limitless. And that's a distinction the AAA industry has mostly forgotten, but thankfully many indie developers have rediscovered. So here's the thing about Final Fantasy VII. It was so successful that the industry learned a new lesson. It changed the emotional contract. It taught developers to direct instead of explore, to show instead of suggest, to funnel instead of wander. And because it worked so well, the genre chased that model for the next 2 decades. The spectacle got bigger, the mystery got smaller. And somewhere in there, RPGs stopped asking players to imagine and started asking them to just keep watching. So I'm interested to know what you think. What was the turning point for you? The RPG where the genre stopped feeling open-ended and started feeling more directed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.